back in London, and I've decided to go to the theatre, which I try and do regularly almost every week, and also I go to the cinema if possible once a week, or sometimes even twice a week. One has to keep up with what the rest of the world is doing. Welcome to A Victim Bites Back, episode 21. I love the theatre in London and the cinemas, but the theatres have a particular atmosphere, and of course everything about it is rather opulent. The beautiful plush red velvet seats, the wonderful auditoriums, always beautifully designed and decorated. Even outside, the out of house, the bars, the entrance and all that, all look absolutely spectacular. And of course the whole thing about stage shows, be they musicals or plays or whatever, is totally different from film. The way they're acted, the way they perform and everything else. I mean, I think one of the reasons some of the great actors in the early days of film, like Laurence Olivier, were actually not great actors, in my opinion, because they still continued a bit of the theatrical stage performance on film, and it never really worked. So you'd have Laurence Olivier on film, in a great film like, say, Rebecca or whatever, sort of slightly over-speaking, over-delivering. My darling, why did you do that? You know, and that works on stage when you're looking at it from ages away and it's all on stage. Doesn't really work in movies, in my opinion. Mind you, some of them developed and became pretty good actors in movies, but the whole art of movie making and stage theatre making are completely different. Anyway, they both fascinate me, and I try and keep up to date. This time I've decided to go and see a revival. In the great days of musicals, there were 4, 5, 6, 7 huge smash hit songs in every single musical. And that's what I really miss these days. Even the musicals of people like Andrew Lloyd Webber sometimes have 1 or perhaps 2 hits in them, but very rarely more than that. And most musicals, even the really successful ones like, say, Hamilton, Matilda or whatever, have no hits in them at all. And that sometimes drives me crazy. Sometimes it's okay. Like, I remember the Book of Mormon, which I thought was terrific, and the music in it fitted the musical brilliantly, although there were no hits there, but it all worked perfectly. I do prefer my musicals to have hits, and believe me, Oklahoma has several. My favourite song in Oklahoma is People Will Say We're in Love, which I once did a version of.
Throw bouquets at me, don't please my folks too much, don't laugh at my jokes too much, people will say we're in love. Don't sigh and gaze at me, your sighs are so like mine, your eyes mustn't glow like mine, people will say we're in love. Don't start collecting things, give me my rose and my love. Don't praise my charms too much, don't look so vain with me, don't stand in the rain with me, people will say we're in love. Don't take my arms too much, don't keep your hand in mine, your hand feels so grand in mine, people will say we're in love. Don't dance all night with me, till the stars fade from above, they'll see it's alright with me, people will say, people will say, people will say we're in love.
The bad news is this version is absolutely awful. By this version, I don't mean my version of the song, which I think is rather good, but the stage show was packed, was absolutely awful. It got great reviews and lots of people seem to have loved it, and every single seat was full, but it really had no advantages or pluses at all. and it's the only show I've ever seen that no talent in any area was involved, and the version of People Will Say We're in Love was far worse than mine. So you make your own judgment. Of course, I went to Charterhouse School in Godalming in Surrey from about the age of 13 to 17 or 18, I suppose. And I thoroughly enjoyed myself there, had a very good education, especially because of 2 or 3 teachers, mainly Spike Phillips and Paddy Gardner, both of whom taught English and who taught me how to love English literature. I remember Paddy Gardner especially when I gave a rant about Jane Austen and said she drove me crazy because all she was interested in were tiny, unimportant little things like whether women would make a lot of money marrying rich and so on and so forth. And after I'd finished the rant, which got the class in great hysteria and laughter, he very quietly said, might I suggest, I'd only read one, I think Pride and Prejudice, might I suggest you read a couple of other Jane Austen books, because you might discover when you read them that she is sort of like an expert in miniaturization, rather like the Japanese making bonsai trees or little things, and that in her miniaturization you get to see the most enormous amount of valuable aspects of the human psyche. And I did, and of course fell in love with it, and as a result became a huge Jane Austen fan. It was also Paddy Gardner who taught me when I was taking my exams, and I think it was either my A-levels or an S-level, scholarship level to Cambridge, that I'd be much better off specialising in a fairly obscure writer than doing what everybody else did, which is writing essays and theses on Shakespeare and Dickens and Jane Austen. And he said, you'd be much better off picking someone who's a little bit less well known, but who you really like, and being an expert on that, because the examiners will get very interested in you. Instead of being one of the 17 essays on Dickens that they're reading, suddenly they're reading something different. And as a result, I became an expert on the work of Thomas Love Peacock, who was kind of a satirist of the Gothic novel and who wrote 4 or 5 very, very good, very interesting and very popular at the time novels. He was also close friends with Shelley, Byron and others. And indeed it stood me in good stead, because I got a scholarship to Cambridge and I went on to get my Master of Arts degree in English literature, and it was all due to Paddy Gardner's advice, Thomas Love Peacock. Incidentally, since then I've written a novel which is available through Amazon and all good retailers, Thomas Love Peacock, Love Tom, and I suggest you purchase a copy immediately and read it without fail.
If you wanna do the twist, look and do the jump. To the ball, 1, 2, 6.
things in the news today. One, of course, Donald Trump being arrested. I'm not a Trump fan in any way. In fact, I can't stand 90% of his policies, but this whole thing is political. And the other was the drug wars murder, Thomas Cashman. More about him in a moment. One of the many things people ask me when we talk about Charterhouse School is how I discovered Genesis. And it is true, I did discover and name and produce the group Genesis. I'd gone back to the school after having left, had my training at Trinity College, Cambridge, and indeed had my first couple of hit records. It's Good News Week and Everyone's Gone to the Moon. And so I went back there in triumph, aged still only about 20, 21, 22. And while I was there, a grubby little Charterhouse schoolboy rushed up to me and thrust a cassette in my hand and said, "Could you please listen to this? It's our local Charterhouse group, or actually one of the houses, Girdlestonites, known as Duckites." And I said, "Yeah, okay." And in those days I had a little, I think, Austin Healey Sprite car, and bunged it in the cassette player in the car, driving back to London after having visited the school for an old boys' day, and immediately was struck by the brilliant vocals, which I thought were absolutely incredible. I also quite liked the songs that I thought were adequate. Anyway, I called the contact number on the cassette tape and managed to get through to the lead singer, who was a boy called Peter Gabriel, aged 16 or 17. And I said to him, "Look, I really like this. I really like your voice. I'd be quite interested in making a record with you." He, of course, was wildly excited, got together the rest of the group. They didn't have a name. I think they were called the Garden Wall or something, but they'd forgotten that name. So I gave them the name Genesis because they were the first of my serious production career. I'd had a couple of hits as producer before of songs I'd written, but this was not my songs, and they were entirely a group in their own right and all that. So I called them Genesis, and I called the first album From Genesis to Revelation, because it was the beginning, the genesis of my producing career. And they turned out to do quite well, really. Genesis. Sad news today. One of my oldest friends in the music business, Seymour Stein, has passed away, aged 80. He was a friend of mine since 1964. We used to meet every year at Midem in the south of France to have dinner together. And in fact, he organised a panel down at Midem, which he and I would answer questions, because he reckoned we were the only two remaining live members of the Midem who'd attended the very first Midem way back in, I think, 1965 or 66. Anyway, dear Seymour, he was a really talented, brilliant music man. He discovered many great artists, including the Ramones, and his major success and big money spinner was Madonna, who he discovered very early on. In fact, before any of the rest of us had heard of her. In fact, he phoned me from his hospital bed in New York one day and said, "I've just found this incredible girl. She's come in. She came into his hospital room, and it forced him to listen to a cassette while he was in bed." Talk about a captive audience. He said, "She's absolutely remarkable." And I said, "Seymour, you know I hate artists. Why on earth would I want to meet her?" He said, No. She's not an artist, Jonathan. She's one of us. She's the kind of person who can be a huge success behind the scenes." I last saw Seymour a couple of years ago in the south of France, just before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, he went and lived with his daughter out in California. And I'd heard he was doing fine out there, but I had lunch the other day with John Reid, who used to be Elton John's manager, until they had a fairly large, publicly reckoned falling out. And John remained close to Seymour, and visited him in California and said he spent several hours chatting very happily with him. And towards the end of the time, Seymour said, and how is that lovely Elton John? And John, rather nervously but politely, said, oh, I believe he's doing fine. And Seymour then looked at John and said, and how's that lovely John Reed? I was always very fond of him. And John didn't know how to reply to that, but it did indicate to both John and me that perhaps all was not well and Seymour would not be with us for much longer. This is still Charterhouse that you're looking at, and this, funnily enough, is my favourite way to access it, up the back route, which culminates at the top with, I think, the very best view of Charterhouse, of our public school, created and invented by Thomas Sutton way, way back hundreds of years ago, still standing and still looking glorious. But isn't this the very best view you can get of Charterhouse Public School, where, as I said, rather like Seymour discovered Madonna, the Ramones and others, where I discovered, named and produced the group Genesis. The other news story of the week is hundreds of queues at Dover with all the stupid people, many of whom voted for Brexit, trying to get out of the UK into the EU, which we've left, in case they weren't aware, and they may well have voted for it. And I'm afraid to say that Brexit took place with a vote for a referendum with people who knew nothing about it and just voted on the slogan. When it happened and after it had happened, I actually recorded a track which we put into my movie Guilty, which I think you might find amusing, and it anticipated all the problems that would come from Brexit. I don't think Brexit is very important. It's the problems of changing over that are absolutely massive. So take a look at We're Leaving, But We Don't Want To from the film Guilty.
We're leaving, but we don't want to. We're leaving.
Thomas Cashman, the drug wars drug dealer killer, who got 42 years for murder, and I've been saying that I don't think it should have been murder, it was a tragic accident, and he should have got less than that, but nobody seems to agree with me. Everybody has fallen for the media story. This is the chapel at Charterhouse, where I first learned to love music. The organ there is fantastic, hits you in the stomach. Anyway, it's Easter at the moment, so happy Easter everybody, if you happen to be religious.